whenever I'm asked to write a short bio for myself, I usually say something like, I'm a folklorist by training and a journalist by trade, because I went to grad school in folklore, which is as you might guess, a very tiny discipline. And then after grad school, I got a job as a newspaper reporter. And so the common denominator between those two things is talking to live humans, getting information through interviews, which is what we're going to be talking about. So here's an agenda for this talk. Wide interview, who, how, and then what to do with the material once you've collected it. Here's the audience participation part. What's the first thing you think of when you think about doing research? The answer is you go to the library typically, or at least historically, let's put it that way. Or thinking in a more modernistic sort of way, you do this. You search for your topic on Google, right? So, but the third thing, and this very much accords with the life of reporters. We always say reporters get their information in three ways. Observation, you are actually there. Document research, which is the library or the internet. And then the third is the talking to live humans part. And as you can see, especially from the photo on the right, there's this is not a brand new thing. I mean, it's a relatively new thing. It's very much a 20th century thing. It's not that people never did interviews before the 20th century, but being able to record interviews certainly made it a lot easier than having to scribble down the words as people are saying them. But we'll talk about scribbling down the words also in a little bit. In terms of my own background with this, I had my first experience in doing this kind of work when I was a grad student at UCLA for my master's thesis, and then I wound up doing it for my dissertation as well. I decided to do a project on present day California gold miners, present day being circa 1980. That's how old I am. And so, yeah, the guy with the dark hair holding the microphone in that photo is me. Back in circa, that was probably 1970. No, it was 1980. And so the gentleman on the lower right-hand corner, his name was Bub Dambacker. His great-grandfather had come to California from Germany in 1850 to mine gold, and they had kept gold mining claims in the family. And at different points since the gold rush of 1849, whenever the price of gold made it worthwhile, they would sort of reactivate their gold mines and their interest in gold mining. So this was in the town of Sonora, California, which you can see on the map. It's kind of, it's about 2.5 hours east of San Francisco in the Sierra Nevada foothills, not that far from Yosemite National Park. And so I made a documentary about contemporary gold mining for my master's thesis, and then went back and did audio interviews for my dissertation, and then wrote about these characters. While I was doing this research, just incidentally, I was living in that little teardrop trailer, and it didn't have any power. I connected it to the big trailer where Bub lived with an extension cord that just went out the window. So that was roughing it in the field, 1980 style. Then a few years later, I got hired by the Library of Congress to work on a project. I just saw, by the way, either in yesterday's paper or today's paper, that Vic Fazio had died. He was a longtime member of Congress. He represented Sacramento. And the reason I bring him up is that it was at the impetus of some Italian-American congressmen in California that the Library of Congress launched this project on Italian-American life in the Western United States. So Fazio was one, and then Leon Panetta, who went on to become the CIA director, but at the time was a congressman from Monterey, California, was the other one who pushed for this project. The idea being that everybody knows about Little Italy in New York and the North End in Boston and South Philly, but that the contributions of Italian Americans in the Western United States was less well known. So we had a number of fieldwork sites. Monterey, California was one, Gilroy, California, the garlic growing capital of the world, as it calls itself. Pueblo, Colorado, so I did interviews with coal miners, with steel workers, with fishermen, and the women in these photos were, I think they were the wives of fishermen putting on a big festival for the beginning of fishing season in Monterey. So anyway, you can see, I don't have, since I'm always the one doing the interview, I never take photos of myself, so I have very few photos of myself in the field. This just happens to be a few of them. So all told, I've been a folklorist for 42 years, a journalist for 37 years, and a journalism educator for 24 years, which makes me 103 years old if you add it all up. Unless, of course, you allow for the possibility that I've been doing some of these things in an overlapping sort of way, in which case I'm somewhat younger than that, not a lot. And the photo just shows back in the days of hauling cassette tape recorders around and doing a lot of my recordings on cassette tapes. These are all interviews with Bub and his friends back in the gold mine project days. So why do we interview people? Here's a quote from Will Durant, who he's best known for these book, or I guess it was a series, multi-volume thing. I'm trying to remember, called The Story of Civilization, Will and Ariel Durant. Very popular book decades ago. But that's pretty on point. The thrust of this quote is that historians typically have paid attention to the movers and shakers in our world. And you may have run across the term, so the great man theory of history, because usually it was men who had the power to just sort of dominate world affairs, and that became the focus of so much historical research. But in making those people the focus, the lives of so-called ordinary people were largely ignored. And so in the 20th century, this movement arose to sort of fill those gaps in history by doing research on the lives of ordinary people. There was a school of French historians who went back all the way back to the Middle Ages, trying to reconstruct what life was like for just everyday life in a typical town in the Middle Ages. You know, what did people eat? What did they do for work? What were their marriage ceremonies like? You know, this real sort of almost like archaeological kind of expedition to try to unearth what daily life was like. And the same idea really took root in during the Great Depression, when the Works Project Administration was conjured into existence by FDR and his administration, and part of that was the Federal Writers Project. And if you look at this quote here, same idea, to start to pay people, just regular working folks, the respect that they deserve. Everybody makes a contribution, as this quote suggests. And to send writers out and do interviews and record people's stories. And so on the right-hand side, you can see it says life history of C.W. Wimster, turpentine man, guy who made turpentine or sold turpentine for a living. I'm not sure what he did, but just as an example of the kind of interviews that were being done as part of the Federal Writers Project. In Pennsylvania, that led to the WPA Guide to Pennsylvania. Books like Men at Work, again, this emphasis on working people who were just laborers, sort of people you'd call like rank and file, as opposed to the big industrialists, the wealthy people, the influential people. The third photo there shows Zora Neale Hurston, who was part of the Federal Writers Project. And then the fourth one there, it just is a sample. It says text of interview, and the interview was done by Nelson Algren. I know a lot of people who went on to become fairly well-known writers were part of the Writers Project, and that's just one of his. In this case, it says the subject is industrial folklore of Chicago. It has the name of the informant, Davy. I can't tell what it says, Dewey Day or Davy Day, but anyway, recorded in April 1939. And this trend toward doing interviews with ordinary people also found a way into the world of journalism, where the Code of Ethics of Society of Professional Journalists, one of the provisions of the code is give voice to the voiceless. Listen to people whose voices we ordinarily do not hear. And it kind of connects to the provision above it, be vigilant and courageous about holding those with power accountable, only because often the so-called voiceless people often kind of get screwed over by the powerful people. And so they're kind of two sides of the same coin. You hold the powerful accountable for how they might be exploiting or mistreating the powerless people. And so one core mission of journalists is to champion people who are whose rights are being trampled on, or living in poverty, and so on and so forth. And I like this quote from Viet Thanh Nguyen. It's this very good book where he's the editor of a volume where a lot of writers who were refugees wrote about their own refugee experience. And he says, he kind of modifies this idea of giving voice to the voiceless by saying, these people have a voice, it's just that nobody's been listening to them. And so the idea of the writer as kind of medium, we talk about the media, like we're just the conduit through which the voices of unheard people could be heard. So it's more a project of listening than giving people a voice. They already have a voice. And then that's one thing I discovered, by the way, in working on the projects that I worked on, was any classist notions I had about what it meant to be, an intelligent person or an educated person. I was really impressed by how articulate people are across all social classes when they talk about their own experiences and the things that matter to them in life. You don't have to have a PhD to speak eloquently about your own experience, is what it comes down to. I learned that from my own father in a way, because my dad only went through high school and became a printer. And I'm sure if he had gotten the opportunities that I had, he certainly could have gotten a PhD, as I did, but he grew up in a different time, child of the Depression and so on. And in a way, I always really enjoyed hearing him speak, just because he had this, let's say, the same intelligence that I had, but he kind of sounded more like he came from the streets. And he had this great New York accent, which I always love to imitate. And so just anyway, the point being that you don't need a fancy education to speak eloquently. And that's what I saw over and over again. So what makes the interview valuable as data? Sometimes we're really trying to fill in gaps about what we know about what happened at a particular place and at a particular time. And so we go to the witnesses, people who were there, and ask them that question: what happened? But also, and this is part of the difference between oral history as done by historians, and folklorists will often talk about life histories, and we often talk about personal experience narratives. And one subtle difference there is if you're a historian, you very much want to know, you want to get an accurate record of what happened at a particular place in a particular time. If you're a folklorist, it's not that you don't care about that, but you recognize that we sort of distort the past in how we remember it. And it's distorted partly by memory, but also partly by our values, what we care about, what aspects of a story interest us or prop up our beliefs about the world in one way or another. And that's worth hearing as well, that we, that the gap between the stories that people tell and what really happened are themselves interesting. Why do they tell the story in that way? Why do they remember what they remember? And the way stories are told and the way they're remembered changes over time. And so if you interview somebody in 1970 about growing up in the Great Depression, the way you tell that story is influenced by the year you're telling it, by it being 1970 and what's going on in the world at that time. You tell the story 20 years earlier and 20 years later, you might tell the story differently, not only because of memory, gaps in your memory, but just because you're a different person. And as you change as a person and your values change and your experiences influence how you change, the stories that you tell and how you tell them change as well, which again is also interesting. I think about Ukraine. I'm thinking about Ukraine every day. I spent time I taught in Ukraine in 2012, and when you've walked the streets of a place and been in those subway stations where people are living, and been in the train stations where people are trying to get out, it it resonates with you at a deeper level, maybe. And so I was thinking, I kind of wish I was in Poland now, setting up a tent so I could record the oral histories of people living through this refugee experience in real time as it's happening. And I haven't ruled out the idea that I'll try to find a way to get there this summer if the situation continues. And here's hoping it does not continue, but if it does. So whom to interview? The short answer to that question is kind of anybody and everybody, because everyone has a story. I would go back to, I don't know if some of you might be familiar with the Foxfire. It became kind of a movement. I don't know if you can read this, but it says an English teacher in 1966, he goes to Georgia. I think he was a Northerner. He wasn't really connecting with his students, doing a traditional English literature kind of a curriculum. And then he got the idea of sending his students out into their own communities to do interviews with their neighbors and their relatives to try to capture their local knowledge, the lore. And the lore would include stories about the past, various kinds of arts and crafts and ways of doing things that were possibly going to be lost as communities modernized. And the idea was to capture these things before it's too late, which often motivates a lot of oral history related projects. Anyway, it proved to be sort of a sensation, this project. The students were thrilled to be doing it. The elders in the communities were thrilled that anybody cared about what they knew, and it was a way for the generations to connect with each other. And so the project took off and is still going to this day. And this slide just shows just a sample of how many books have been generated by Foxfire. So just switching gears a little bit in terms of connecting with your elders and who to interview. I often teach a column writing class at Penn State because I'm a columnist myself. And last semester, I had 2 students in my column writing class who wrote about their parents. And these are just such classic immigrant stories and such classic sort of reactions of a child of immigrants to feeling embarrassed by their parents and by their parents' accents and by the weird food that they eat compared to what their their peers at school eat, and then as they mature, coming to appreciate what their parents, the gift that their parents are giving them of this knowledge of this other culture, and then embracing that culture. So if you just take a minute to read these next few slides, you'll see what I'm talking about. You can see that first paragraph, fairly typical that somebody might not be able to work at the job that they were trained for when they arrive in a new country because of either a language problem or a credentialing problem. You get certified to do something in one country doesn't mean that certification will work in another country, that you have to get retrained or additional education. Their struggle to express themselves in English, her embarrassment. And then if you look at the next one, similar story. And this is a very, again, the lunchroom moment when you're eating food that's different from the kids around you is often a very sort of traumatic one for a lot of children of immigrants. Food that smells weird. Talks about their heavily accented English, trouble communicating, her embarrassment. But then, if you look at the next slide, goes from being ashamed to being proud, minoring in Chinese. Starting to cook some of the food that her mom made. How much their parents struggled, as so many immigrants do. And winding up with that pride in her identity. I mean, that is just, as I said, it is the American immigration story. So there's always an urgency about doing oral history projects. I can't tell you how many times I've shown up in communities and I've told people what I'm there for, and they say, you should have come 10 years ago, because all these people who really know something about the past, they're gone. It's like, well, but that's always going to be true. So you have to not worry about it and just go when you go and catch the people who are there. Casey Stengel, for those who don't know, was a longtime baseball guy, was the manager of the Yankees, and then became the manager of the New York. In fact, again, coincidentally, the story in the New York Times today, this is the 60th anniversary of the birth of the New York Mets with Casey Stengel as their first manager. So there was a story about it in the paper today. Another point I wanted to make about who to interview is a story that I heard about a reporter at another paper who started this project where, I don't know for how many months he did this, but every week he opened the phone book to a random page and just put his finger down on a random name and then would call that phone number and ask if he could do an interview with that person. And lots of times they were puzzled, not surprisingly, why do you want to do an interview with me? And he's, no, I'm just doing interviews with people around the community. And sometimes they'd say, well, my life is not very interesting. I don't think so. And he would try to convince them that really everybody's life is interesting. And sometimes he would succeed. If when he didn't succeed, he would just finally flip the phone book open to a new page and put his finger down on another name and then make a phone call until he got somebody to agree to have him come out. And I think the series of stories he produced proved his point, which is that if you ask people good questions, you will get stories from them, because nobody lives a life without incident. Things happen to us. Things happen to all of us. And so you establish some rapport with that person, get them to relax a little bit and tell you about their lives, and you can write an interesting profile of them, which is what his goal was, just a newspaper length, fairly short profile. So depending on what your research interests are, you pick out people in a community to interview. So then the question becomes, how do you do it? So again, getting back to the Federal Writers Project, anthropologists often refer to this as establishing rapport. You can't expect people to just open up to you as a stranger immediately. You've got to kind of pass the time of day with them a little bit, get to know each other a little bit, do what you can to make them feel comfortable, and maybe then they'll start talking. Usually you need to pay, depending on the nature of the project and how much time you have, but what works best is repeated visits. You show up once and they might give you kind of the abridged version of their life. They'll give you the minimum. Come back again and they're going to be impressed. They're going to say, this person's really, really interested in me, not just fulfilling some assignment, not just, checking a box. If you keep coming back day after day, week after week, as I did with that guy I mentioned at the beginning, Bub Dambacker, after a while, I knew his whole life story backwards and forwards. Although there's always things that come out. I did a life history interview with my dad when he was 92. And he told me some stories I'd never heard. And I was saying, as I sat there, I said, how is it that I don't know this? I've known you all these years, my whole life to be exact. And you're telling me some of these stories for the first time. So there's always more. And some of it is just about asking the right question, which is what we're going to get to. So some bits of advice about doing interviews. It's good to do some research about your person, or sometimes about the person, sometimes just about the events or set of events that you want to find out about through your interview with that person. So I have that first example there of when Joe Paterno was around. I would tell my Penn State students that if you had an opportunity to interview Coach Paterno, it really wouldn't do to ask him questions like that one. That the expectation is that you had looked that stuff up and knew about it. That there would be no point in asking questions, the answers to which are readily available from all kinds of other documentary sources. So that's one thing. And to, in order to ask informed questions, you have to get the necessary background. So it's a good idea. So one thing Chris Farley did do, I guess correctly, was that he had a question list. And just the act of preparing questions gets you to thinking about what you want to find out from this person, as opposed to just walking in cold. It also is a handy prompt because there's a good chance you'll be nervous. I've done 1,000 interviews. I'm still nervous when I do them. And you don't want to just blank out in the middle of the interview and not know what to ask next. And when you do get to an awkward silence, you've got this sheet that you can rely on to get you into the next question. This is a fairly famous set of formulations about open-ended. Usually they refer to open-ended versus closed-ended. I call them dead-end questions because they don't go anywhere. So example of a dead-end question, do you like being a high school principal? Yeah, it's just kind of like what Chris Farley did. Remember when you were in the Beatles? Yeah, I do. How could he not remember that? Here's an open-ended question. What do you like about being a high school principal? This does not come from an actual interview with a high school principal, by the way. I made this up. And the best sort of open-ended questions are invitations to tell stories. And so as an example, if you were to ask somebody, what was your worst day as a principal? And let's say the principal recalls, it was 9/11, we got the news, we had to decide, do we tell the kids? If we do tell the kids, how is that going to work? we're going to end the school day early. I mean, those of you who were teaching at that time, probably remember what that day was like in the classroom. I know that I do. So, but that's what you're after. You're after stories from your sources. Best interviews are conversations. So yes, you want to prepare a question list, but you don't want to be totally wedded to it, that all you're doing is looking down at your list and not making eye contact with your source and not really listening to the answers to your questions. Because what often will happen is an answer will suggest a whole bunch more questions that you hadn't thought to ask because you didn't know what the answer to the question that you did ask was going to be. So, I mean, for example, you interview somebody about their childhood and they tell you that when they were 8 years old, their house burned down. You'd want to follow up. You wouldn't want to just go, so tell me about your high school years. You want to say, well, wait a minute, what was it? Tell me about the day your house burned down and what happened? What did the family lose? How did the family get back on its feet? Where did they move to? How long did it take to recover from an experience like that? And so on. I mean, it suggests all kinds of questions. So you have this list, but you also improvise and respond to what comes up in the conversation. And also, you don't want to bury yourself in your list because you want to provide feedback. Nodding at people really helps, smiling at people helps, those kinds of things. Just indicators that you are actually listening to them. You're not just dutifully checking stuff off. We're going to skip that. The importance of setting, where do you conduct interviews? Question of why doing something on somebody's home turf? Anybody care to venture a answer to that question? There are things, well, I'll show you. I use this expression, you shall know them by their stuff, that people surround themselves with objects that they care about, mementos, souvenirs, family photos. This photographs, a person going through a photo album is a great way to do an interview because the photos themselves will recall memories and will trigger storytelling about the people in the photos and the events being photographed. And so that's why I call the house is an information-rich environment. You can learn things about the person you're interviewing just from the things that they surround themselves with. I'm looking around in my own office here, for example. I talked about being in Greece a couple of years ago, and I have this giant map of the city of Thessaloniki right over here, over my right shoulder. Everything I look at has some meaning to me. I took a photo in my office on campus for this presentation, and on top of a shelf above my desk, I've got a jazz album. I'm a jazz fan. A crossword puzzle blown up from when I entered a crossword puzzle contest because I'm a sort of fanatical crossword puzzle guy. I used to work at the Maritime Museum in San Francisco, so I've always liked the world of boats, and I got this little souvenir boat when I was in Portugal. Newspaper connection, and my dad having been a printer at newspapers for part of his working life. That's a pressman's hat. You fold the newspaper and put it on your head so you don't get ink on your top of your head. I lived in California for about 20 years, and Yosemite National Park became one of my favorite places. That is actually a rock we stole from Yosemite Park, probably a federal crime. I grew up in New York City. Nathan's Hot Dogs was a big part of my childhood on Coney Island, and I grew up rooting for the New York Yankees. A lot of people hate the Yankees, and I get that, but it's like, what can I say? It was my childhood. They were my hometown team, so I rooted for them. So all those things are information about me, just as an example. Yes, you can do interviews in the same way we're doing this today. on some kind of video chat. It kind of reminds me, there's one of my favorite movies is Woody Allen's movie, Broadway Danny Rose. And there's a scene in that movie where the main character serves a bunch of frozen turkey dinners to his guests on Thanksgiving. And one of the guests says, it's just as good as the real, the frozen, you know, and it's not, you know, it's like, yes, you can do it. Like we can do this the way we're doing it today. You all probably taught on Zoom last year. I taught on Zoom all year last year. We got through it. It wasn't the same as being in the classroom. Talking to somebody remotely is not the same as being in their presence, right? But, you know, sometimes people are embarrassed by their home, maybe needlessly so. They're ashamed of their poverty. They're ashamed of what's, you know, slobs they are. I mean, who knows? I mean, people can be very self-conscious about their environments, and it would be a relief to not have somebody come into their home. You know, if you're talking about interviewing somebody who doesn't live right around the corner, just getting to that person becomes a consideration. And of course, during a pandemic like the one we've been living through, this was the way to go. I tried to keep doing my interviews with people, my sources in Greece. Once we got back, I decided it wasn't worth it. I decided I was just going to wait till I was able to go back there again. So the project is just kind of on hold as a result. Now, other considerations are ways of recording interviews. And, you know, when I started as a reporter, mostly we used reporters' notebooks and these were not long, in-depth life history interviews. These were shorter newspaper length interviews. And so there were a lot of advantages to that. You know, I think the more high tech you get, the more self-conscious the person you're interviewing might be. You know, maybe that's less of a consideration now than it used to be because people have gotten a lot more used to technology in their lives. But there, it's going to depend on the experience of the person you're interviewing. Technology can fail. I've never had a reporter's notebook blow out on me yet. They always work. Although you could run out of pages and you can also run out of ink in your pen. So you always carry an extra pen. The real advantage is that what you don't write down everything. You are not a transcribing machine as someone's talking. You couldn't possibly get down every word that they say. So you're already editing what they say in choosing on the fly which parts of their conversation to write down and which to just let go by as being somewhat less interesting. And so when you have to retrieve that information, instead of having to go through an entire transcript, you've kind of got the highlights. It can be stressful, of course, because sometimes you're writing down what someone's saying because that seems really good and you haven't finished, and then they're going on to saying something else, which is actually even more interesting. And then you say, oh, geez, now what do I do? Do I abandon the first quotes in order to get the second quote? I'm not going to be able to get them both. I mean, you can always paraphrase. And again, it depends on what your purposes are. If you want to produce a full transcript of the entire interview, taking notes is not the way to go. If you want to just write a profile of the person, it might be perfectly adequate. So yeah, you can't get every word. The single biggest problem that I've had with taking notes is that I write so fast and so scribbly that I can't read my own handwriting, which can be kind of frustrating. And here's where you have the danger of misquoting somebody because you didn't get their words down accurately. And then you could make them unhappy. Audio recordings. Obviously, they get all the words, unless you forgot to change the batteries or forgot to turn it on, which has happened to me and happens to everybody. If they do enough recordings, sooner or later, you're going to have a problem like that. I was interviewing people after the 1989 earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I had this terrific interviewee. She had been on the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge at the time of the earthquake. And she didn't feel the earthquake, but she saw all these people who were farther along on their journey across the bridge had gotten out of their cars and were running toward her, running off the bridge. And so she didn't even know what had happened. And she got out of her car. She started running too. And she was telling me the story. It was very dramatic. And then I realized the whole time I had the play button pushed, not the record button. And so I didn't get it. And I was like, when that happens, you just tear your hair. So that is a thing that can happen. So yeah. Thing about audio recordings is that it's only audio, right? You don't get any of the visual stuff. Because you have to make sure that things are working properly in terms of volume and power and the right settings and all that stuff, it can be a distraction for you as an interviewer when it doesn't just fail altogether. So those are disadvantages. Then there's video recordings. Obvious advantage, they get all the words and they get all the visuals. But when I say all the visuals, it's pretty limited, right? It's just whatever appears in the frame. You could wander around the house with somebody and get video of their entire environment, which is not a bad idea. But the more technology you introduce, again, the more complicated everything gets. People are really likely to be self-conscious when they're on camera. They're being looked at by this electronic eye. They're worried, like, is this my good side? Does my hair look okay? Is my stomach sticking out? Or, all the things, people, everybody's insecure about their appearance, right? Probably even supermodels, male and female. But so again, advantages and disadvantages to every way there is of recording interviews. How do you decide what to do? For most purposes, I would say it's not either or, it's kind of a both. Either take notes and make an audio recording, or take notes and make a video recording. And one of the things that does for you is your notes can become a guide to what's being recorded. So if there are you can get the highlights. You can just make little notes to yourself at 19 minutes and 2 seconds, great story about his service in Vietnam or something like that. So you can makes retrieval of that information that much easier. And then if you're making an audio recording, a lot of the visual, yes, you can take photographs while you're there, but also you can just do a lot of descriptive writing, describing the person, their gestures, their manner, again, the objects in the room, all those kinds of visual details that the audio recording is not capturing. Finally, there's what to do with the material that you've obtained via the interview. And again, it largely depends on what are your purposes? What kind of project are you working on? In the journalism world, but also in other contexts, we write a lot of profiles. And so here's an example. Dan Barry, one of the more talented writers at the New York Times, did a profile of the guy who played the Munchkin coroner in The Wizard of Oz. And you can just read the opening paragraphs of this story while I sip my tea. This is sometimes we refer to this as sort of a teaser lead. It doesn't tell you immediately that who this person is. He's a coroner, but you don't know that he's talking about the Wizard of Oz. But then as you get toward the bottom of the second paragraph, the striped socks curling back, you start to, maybe you get an intimation of where this is going, but maybe not. Maybe you'd have to get all the way down to the fourth paragraph, Munchkin City coroner. case of a woman killed by a house that fell from the sky. Then that's your that's the reveal, right? So in other words, you take the visual detail that you've taken notes about, you take your audio recording, and just your own perceptions, and you kind of whip that up into a story. It's a combination of direct quotes, indirect quotes, description, and what I was going to call it observation, but I mean observation kind of a more, there's physical observation, but it's kind of almost more psychological observation. A simpler way to handle interview material is just kind of do this interview dump into a form of a Q&A piece. And they're very popular in journalism. They're relatively easy to do because you don't have to kind of craft a narrative. You just supply the questions and the answers. In almost every case, the Q&As that you see in from news sources are cleaned up. They're edited somewhat. People's speech tends to be, as you no doubt noticing listening to me, tends to be kind of messy. People are cluttering their speech with you knows and likes and ers and ums and all that kind of stuff. And it just makes for a less readable document. It's like we hear that stuff, we're able to screen out the noise from the content when we're hearing it in conversation, but when we read it on the page, it doesn't read well. And so at the very least, those things will be stripped out by an editor. And also you're just going to use the highlights from the interview, the most interesting comments, not everything that was said. And then finally, you might just want to just have the transcript. And of course, now there are transcribing programs. Often you have to go back over them and do a lot of cleaning up because sometimes it just doesn't get it accurately. I had a friend from New Zealand who was trying to use a voice, translator voice into print. And the thing was not set up to really catch the New Zealand accent. It was kind of hilarious to see that the transcript that was produced when he spoke, it did much better when I spoke, but they always need to be cleaned up. But I used to, before that, I used to just laboriously listen to the tape and then every few seconds stop it. I remember a lot of people had foot pedals so you can stop and start the tape more easily. But it was very laborious activity. The one great thing about having done that, though, is by the time you're done, you really know the material. And then if you want to use that raw material for some other purpose, you can retrieve information that much faster because you remember what's there. So again, it depends on what sort of project you're doing. So finally, to find out more about doing these kinds of projects, the American Folklife Center, which, as I said, I've done projects for, part of the Library of Congress, they put out this excellent guide to folklore and fieldwork. It used to just be a printed booklet, but now, of course, happily, it's available online. And so you could look at that. There's also the Oral History Association has a link to an entire page of guides to doing oral history. So there's additional information there as well. This is from the table of contents to this Folklife and Fieldwork booklet. And you can see some of the headings, deciding what to record, deciding on the people to interview, getting comfortable with your equipment, creating your interview questions, just some of the things that I've talked about today. And it also covers one other thing, this business of release forms, which I just wanted to touch upon. They have release forms in the book, in the document. There are many, many release forms out there. They're all kind of variations on a theme. It's a good idea to get people to sign the forms, getting their permission to use their words in whatever context you wind up wanting to use them, putting them on a bulletin board in school, making some kind of museum exhibition, putting it in an archive, showing it on local television, whatever it might be, it's good to get permission. People can be uncomfortable with that. Some people have this kind of knee-jerk response. Well, I don't want to sign anything because I don't want to commit to anything that becomes a legal document. But usually it's just a formality to get people to sign things. So the last slide, yay, is a guy from Afghanistan I met in Greece. And just in terms of the power of the interview, the kinds of information that's just so valuable. I mean, to hear firsthand about someone's experience. I just want to just take a minute to tell you about this guy Morteza. He's probably, what is he now? He's probably 28. When I met him, he was 26. He grew up in Afghanistan. A moment came when the Taliban came knocking on the door and they wanted him to join. And he didn't want to join. And this guy took a kettle with boiling water in it and poured it on his arm as a kind of sample of what else would be in store for you if you don't join us. And so at that point, the family says, we have to get out of here. And so he had a sister who was 12 at the time. Yeah, he was he was 16, I think. His sister was 12. And one of the members of the Taliban wanted to marry his sister. And they didn't want that to happen either, needless to say. And so they fled from Afghanistan. They went to Iran and they worked there for a time, kind of under the table, kind of undocumented immigrants. And then they accumulated a little bit of money in Iran. Then they made their way to Turkey, had to pay these human traffickers, all kinds of money, and finally got to a port on the Turkish coast. And we're about to get on a boat. The boat, he told me, was supposed to hold, I think 40 or 50 people, I can't remember. There were close to 90 on the boat. His family, I think there were 5 or 6 of them were the last, 5 people, were the last people to get on. They all got on except for his dad. That made 90. And the smugglers said, that's it. No one else can get on. And they said, yeah, but we're all family. We want to stay together. He says, nope, sorry. And their dad said, don't worry about it. I'll get the next one. And I'll meet you on the island. And the way the story ended when I interviewed him was that they never saw him again. When I spoke to him, when I get back to the States, they finally, after maybe 6 years, they found each other. And then the sad ending of the story is that shortly after that, his father had a heart attack and died. But this guy had just lived through. And then the other piece of the story was about life as a refugee in Greece. He went to a refugee camp, figuring to stay a few weeks. The family wound up staying there for 4 years. And then he finally got a job. This photo reflects that. This organization. He's very adept with languages. He learned Greek, he learned English. And so he got a job serving as a translator, as a go-between between all the people, all the NGOs, the Greek ones, the English-speaking ones, and fellow refugees. And now he has his own apartment, so he's kind of landed on his feet. I noticed when I interviewed him at the age of 26, he already had gray hair, and like little wonder, he'd had a pretty hellish time. But you can't get those stories from anyone other than the person who lived through it, right? So that's part of the value. So that's the last slide, and I am happy to take any questions you might have about any of this. And thanks for listening.